When you think of English cities, as in the big famous English cities, there's a lot you could choose from. You've got your Londons, your Birminghams, your Bristols, your Manchesters and the like, but of all of England's several sizable settlements, there's one I see rarely talked about as much, if ever. Here's a really specific question, but bear with me. What's the biggest city in the UK that begins with L? Seems like it's an easy question, right? It's London. Not quite. Technically, London is not one city, London is 33. Liverpool is a closer one, but that's also wrong. It's a lot closer though. It's Leeds. With a headcount of a little under 1 million, Leeds is the UK's second largest urban district, and one you've probably never heard of. Come and join me on this rather specific journey across the many eras of our history, as I recount a tale as old as time itself, I think. The story of Leeds, the British metropolis that you have never heard of. Represented vexillologically by 3 stars and a golden ram on a blue background, Leeds is a major city in the historic county of Yorkshire, located roughly halfway between the cities of York and Manchester. It's one of Britain's 11 core cities and is the largest city in north of England, beating out Sheffield, Liverpool and even mighty Manchester, which is generally seen as Britain's second city. People from Leeds are called Leodensian, that's me, or Loiners if you prefer to be a bit quirky. It's a manufacturing hub and one of the largest financial centres in the Isles. With a GDP bigger than Bulgaria, it's England's place to be for banking, shopping, eating and doing all kinds of business. Outside of London, of course. Before I make it sound like it's one big capitalist hellscape, Leeds is a major cultural centre too, home to Northern England's largest city punk, one of the biggest music festivals in the country, live albums by both Pete and Devin Townsend, the best Pink Floyd song, the best Grand Theft Auto game, and the world's oldest film, the 2-second Round A Garden scene, with a staggering 7.3 out of 10 on IMDb. Chances are, if you're familiar to do with anything with Leeds, it'll be sport. Leeds is home to a world-class rugby team as well as England's most successful cricket team. And yet the one you'll be familiar with is Leeds United, the city's pretty okay football team. This football fervour means that anyone from Leeds is familiar with the age-old question. Oh, so you're a Leeds fan? Leeds is not to be confused with the rope you keep dogs in check with, any of these eponymous towns in the US and Canada, and most importantly, this castle which is actually in Kent, Elon Musk. This annoys me more than it should. Right, that's Leeds now. But how did we get here? Nowadays, no one's really quite sure where the name Leeds actually comes from. The general consensus is that the name's origin comes from the Celtic word ledensis, meaning people of the fast-flowing river, probably referring to what we now call the River Aire. Other possible origin points include the Old Brythonic word leto, meaning an animal's sexual drive, or if you want to be really boring, the Welsh word lwyd, meaning a place. I mean, it's not wrong, Leeds is a place. The first actual mention of anything we today call our lovely little Leeds is from St. Bede's Historica Ecclesiastica. That's a book about English churches at the time, where he discusses the construction of a church in the region known as Lwydus. A side note on that name, Leeds City Council has a big archive of photos dating back to the 1870s under the name Leodis, an Old English form of the name. Notice how he doesn't say anything close to village or settlement, but region. From what we know, Lwydus was the name of a forest somewhere in the south of Northumbria. Nonetheless, Lwydus was an important seat of local power and the centre of the Celtic kingdom of Elmet, whose name can still be found in places today. As for actual settlements within this forest of Lwydus, the most likely candidate was a Roman fort named Cambodunum, believed to be either at Quarry Hill or near modern-day Huddersfield. It's a pretty big gap if you ask me. At this point, the idea of a place called anything close to Leeds was more of a suggestion, really, and the settlement we'd come to know could have taken on many different names. Here's a list of some of the names that Leeds could have ended up with along the way. All was well in our little area of England, until a monarchical dispute in the south led to perhaps the biggest turning point in Leeds' history and the moment that set it up for greatness. The new King William of Normandy turned his sights north. The harrying of the north was nothing short of a genocide on the part of William of Normandy, massacring and displacing potentially up to 75% of the population of everywhere from the Humber to the Tees in an act of pure subjugation. Fortunately for our story, Leeds was spared from this brutality. At the advent of King William's reign, the estate around the now clearly settlement of Leeds, now taking on the name Leeds, was given to one Ilbert de Lacy, a favourite of William's. By around 1100, Leeds would go on to have a population of no greater than 200, and go on to spend the next century or two as just another small town among many under the domain of the de Lacy family, centred in the nearby town of Pontefract, being no greater than such made-up sounding places as Ullerskelf, Appleton, Roebuck and Kippax. In fact, many towns that are all but near villages nowadays, like Ripon or Tickhill, would exceed Leeds in importance for centuries after the Norman conquests. Hell, I didn't even know Tickhill existed until doing my research. That's how you know Leeds was in a pretty poor state. By 1377, tax returns showed that the population of the little parish had grown to about 1,000, putting it closer in rank to the other larger towns of the lower half of Yorkshire. Unfortunately for it and everyone else, Leeds was cursed with the bad case of the Black Death, and thus any progress it had made at growth was undone. For years after, Leeds and the many other prominent towns in the area remained little more than villages, producing the bare minimum of grain and cloth. Leeds remained small in land area too, being little more than 26 acres protruding from the River Aire. Leeds seems to thrive in turmoil, however, and while the Battle of Towton raged on in a fellow Yorkshire town, Leeds was undergoing a transformation into something more akin to the Leeds of today. By the Tudor period, Leeds had come under the sole dominion of the Crown, and the town's woolen industry had gone from simply producing the clothing necessary to survive to an institution the burgeoning town would come to be associated with. Within the coming century, this caught the eye of the new Stuart King James, and by 1626, the city received its first charter, turning it from a small village orbiting around the influence of Pontefract Castle to a town in its own right. These privileges were not complete, however, as the Crown still had the authority to appoint whoever it pleased in the local government. It seemed that Leeds would have a long way to go before truly attaining representation in its own right. No more than 18 years after Leeds received its first charter, it found itself as part of a league of towns in Yorkshire that sought to settle the brewing discontent between the king and his parliament. Alas, no such agreements could be made, and England would be plunged into 13 years of constant war. For the first time, Leeds itself would become a battleground. The Battle of Leeds sparked only 5 months into the First English Civil War, as 2,000 royalist men and 3,000 parliamentarians attempted to keep Leeds out of each other's grasp. Leeds, now spelt with 3 E's, had become an important holding as it held a large share in Yorkshire's cloth industry and sat in the middle of an important route between Chester and York. A far cry from the town of absolutely no significance that existed centuries before. After temporarily reverting back to royalist control following the nearby Battle of Seacroft Moor, most of northern England would end up again under parliamentarian control by the end of 1644. In the end, Leeds made it out of the English civil wars mostly unscathed. It had proven itself in the battlefield. Now it had to prove itself in Parliament and carve a seat for itself in the now dominant House of Commons. Since the introduction of the House of Commons to this point, Leeds had never had a seat of its own, simply coming under the constituency of Yorkshire in its near entirety, and eventually the smaller West Riding constituency. Yet at the same time, many of the small towns Leeds had surpassed still retained their centuries-old seats in Parliament. Leeds would finally see some representation with a single member of Parliament in 1654, followed by a second in 1656. This newfound representation was not to last, however, with both members being recalled and Leeds having its constituency status revoked, with the return of the monarchy in 1660. The little town would receive a silver lining a year later, as in 1661, the Merry Monarch Charles II amended the town's original charter, granting the city a mayorship and local elections. With the town's first mayor, Thomas Danby, came the town's coat of arms. 3 stars, with a black stripe, taken from Danby's own coat of arms, with a golden sheep situated in the middle to signify the wool trade. This is the insignia that the modern Leeds City Council still uses to this day. In the coming decades, the wool trade would come to dominate the economy of Leeds, with the town providing 30% of Great Britain's wool exports by the end of the 18th century. It's here where the modern city of Leeds truly begins to crystallise. Benedictine monks had been farming flocks of sheep and forging a local textile industry in the city as far back as 1400, but by the 18th century mills had been popping up everywhere, especially in the rapidly growing southern half of the city in villages like Hunslet and Armley, which by this point had been subsumed into the greater borough of Leeds. This growth of industry led to the creation of a really wiggly canal between Leeds and Liverpool built between 1770 and 1816, aptly named the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, and one of the first commercial railways in the world, some of which still run today in the south of the city. With these new connections also came a diversification of the economy. Leeds had become more than just a wool economy. Seacroft grain, Stender timber, Middleton coal, Bermontos pottery and Kirkstall iron fueled what had gone from a market town to an economic juggernaut in less than a century. By 1889, Leeds had become the largest town borough in Britain, with a population of 300,000. And that was a problem. Let's sidetrack for a little while we talk about somewhere very, very similar. Sheffield was another major town in the southern half of Yorkshire. Like Leeds, Sheffield had blazed its way up the city tech tree and gone from not even really existing in the mid-13th century to being one of the largest producers of steel in the world, and the second largest town borough in England by 1843. In 1893, Sheffield announced to the world that it was seeking the status of city to mark its 50th anniversary of its boroughship. When the Leeds Town Council heard about this, they were furious. Leeds had been a borough for centuries by this point and were bigger and more significant than this overgrown steel mill to the south. They immediately got to work sending their own application to Queen Victoria to protect their own interests and the dignity of themselves and the town. That's right, the reason Leeds became a city is down to pure spite. Both petitions were received by Queen Victoria that February, and later that month on the same day, both Leeds and Sheffield were ordained as cities. That's kinda neat actually, Leeds and Sheffield became cities on the same day. Aww. As the political winds changed throughout Europe and the 20th century came rolling in, Leeds would find itself not at the forefront anymore, but very much in the background. As the continent threw itself face first into 2 world wars, Leeds would do little more than provide munitions for the war effort. That didn't stop them from naming a hill or two after Ypres, of course. In the Great War's more critically acclaimed sequel, Leeds would see some damage but not much. Turns out that being as far inland as northern England allows makes you pretty immune to German bombs. The city managed to survive the worst of the Blitz, with the biggest casualty being this slightly dodgy park in Beeston. And if you've ever seen what Beeston looks like, you'll know that very little of value was lost. Unfortunately, things would become rather bleak for Leeds, and for the first time the city would not thrive in turmoil, but would for a time be its undoing. The post-war period hit the city harder than both world wars combined, as Great Britain moved away from manufacturing jobs and into the tertiary market. The economy of Leeds was absolutely shattered, as all of these goods were no longer coming from Leeds, they were coming from East Asia, Africa and South America. Some areas made out alright. The more affluent suburbs north of the river like Headingley and Roundhay stayed affluent thanks to their distance from the city centre, and Quarry Hill went from being God's least favourite slum to Britain's biggest social housing project, but much of the rest of the city crumbled away into economic destitution. Those great centres of production, Hunslet, Bermontoffs, Armley and Seacroft, would succumb to becoming mere commuter suburbs and council estates, and poor old Stender would be wiped from the map immediately, becoming little more than a main road and a few budget hotels. I'll be honest, I didn't even know Stender existed until I saw its name on OpenStreetMap rather recently. There are no signs denoting its existence and almost no results on Google, aside from a few letting agents using its name. Perhaps worst of all, the population of the city would begin to stagnate in more recent years, growing little more than 20,000 between 1951 and 2001. If fate were unkind to our Leeds, this would be the end of our story, as was the case with most post-industrial towns across England. But fate was kind to our Leeds. Thanks to further diversifying and acquiring lucrative business and government headquarters like Channel 4 and NHS England, Leeds was able to bounce back to the forefront of domestic English politics. In 1995, Leeds became a co-founding member of the Core Cities, an alliance of major cities with the goal of curbing London's economic chokehold on the country, of which a Leeds woman sits at the chair. Since then, the city has seen nothing but growth in its economy, population and skyline. Leeds has learned from its past mistakes, harbouring England's most diverse economy outside of London. Leeds is a metropolis looking forwards towards the future, but never forgetting where it came from. Perhaps not as famous as its contemporaries, but by no means hidden away. It took 1,000 years to get here, and there's little doubt Leeds will prosper for 1,000 more. May the future smile upon Leeds, the British metropolis that you had never heard of.